Custer is deceased, yet the narrative does not conclude at the site of his demise. What followed was even more horrifying, more human, and more concealed than anyone was willing to acknowledge. This account transcends mere defeat. It delves into the consequences when retribution knows no bounds. Certain aspects were so appalling that they had to be concealed from the American populace. Corpses were desecrated, men were mutilated beyond recognition, and Custer himself was so savagely treated that the army felt compelled to deceive his widow. This represents the unspoken reality of what transpired following Custer's final stand. For the triumphant Lakota and Cheyenne, it was only natural to commence by plundering their fallen adversaries. The American soldiers possessed various valuable items that now rightfully belonged to the victors, who would have acted similarly had the outcome of the battle been reversed. Weapons, jewelry, clothing, badges, and even horses left on the battlefield were now theirs for the taking. Lakota warrior Brave Bear witnessed the events unfold. He remarked, "There was much commotion and disputes over the horses and firearms that were seized. The Indians were telling one another, 'I have some tobacco, I have coffee, I have a fine gun.' For the warriors, the spoils were a deserved reward. However, this looting process showed little regard for the deceased. Nearly all of them were stripped of their garments and left to decay in the sun. Feet were severed to facilitate the theft of their boots. The Lakota and Cheyenne customarily took scalps from their vanquished foes, and this occasion was no exception. For hours following the battle, the hills presented a horrifying spectacle of warriors removing the scalps of the deceased as war trophies. It was not solely the men who were targeted. Native accounts vividly recall how the women of the camp also approached and desecrated the bodies. Two Cheyenne women asserted that they had driven ALS into Custer's ears. Years later, it was disclosed that someone had forced an arrow into an unspeakable location in Custer's trousers. This was a detail that the army chose to keep secret to prevent distressing his widow. According to the Lakota warrior Iron Hawk, some of Custer's soldiers feigned death to evade capture, only to be apprehended by these women. He recalled witnessing two elderly women strip one corpse and commence dismembering him, only for the soldier to suddenly rise and attempt to fend them off. The soldier was swiftly killed, but Iron Hawk found the sight of a naked man trying to repel two elderly women to be quite humorous. One individual who allegedly did not find it amusing was Sitting Bull. He claimed that his visions had predicted a significant victory, but cautioned that if his warriors disturbed the dead, they would incur a curse. It remains uncertain whether Sitting Bull genuinely opposed the mutilation. Since interviews with him occurred only years after his defeat, he may have been attempting to distance himself from actions that the public deemed scandalous. However, the battle was far from over with Custer's demise. The majority of the 7th Cavalry remained alive under Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Bentyne, who had entrenched themselves atop Reno Hill. Sitting Bull's warriors launched an assault against them throughout the night of the 25th and all day on the 26th. They only ceased their attack on the morning of the 27th, when their scouts spotted incoming American reinforcements. Bentyne and Reno had been too preoccupied with their struggle for survival to ascertain what had transpired with Custer. It was actually the reinforcements led by General Alfred Terry and Colonel John Gibbon who first comprehended the magnitude of the catastrophe at Little Bighorn. Gibbon's scouts were the first to encounter the bloodied garments of American officers in deserted camps not far from the battlefield. These had been plundered from the deceased, but were abandoned when Sitting Bull retreated. The news of the grisly discovery had scarcely reached Gibbon and Terry when a second scout arrived with even more dire news. The scout reported that he had counted 197 dead bodies lying in the hills. The first question asked was about white men. "Yes, white men," the scout responded. At that moment, Terry and Gibbon realized that something had gone horribly wrong. They feared that the entire 7th Cavalry might have been annihilated, but their scouts soon located survivors from Bentyne and Reno on the nearby hills. Terry and Gibbon hurried to meet them. They discovered Bentyne and Reno, battered yet alive, with most of their men intact. Both men were unaware of Custer's calamity and had presumed he had deserted them in pursuit of glory. They were swiftly corrected. Bentyne and a portion of his men were sent to locate Custer. What they encountered was disastrous. The naked corpses of their comrades had begun to decompose after 2 days under the scorching Montana sun. They initially found the bodies of L Company, commanded by Custer's brother-in-law, Lieutenant James Calhoun. The bodies remained in the defensive formation they had assumed in their final moments at the summit of Calhoun Hill. Most of the other bodies did not exhibit such a formation. It was uncertain whether they had all been killed in a state of panic or if the Native Americans had subsequently moved the bodies. Another group of bodies was concentrated on what became known as Last Stand Hill. Private Jacob Adams was the first to discover the commanding officer of the 7th. He promptly called Captain Bentine, who rushed over to verify the identity. "By God," Bentine exclaimed, "that is him." George Custer's body was located near the summit of Last Stand Hill, 20 feet away from his brother Tom. Like the other men, he had been stripped of all his clothing except for his socks. General Custer had not been scalped, although Tom had. The body was discovered in an upright position, leaning against the corpses of 2 other soldiers, as if at rest. His facial expression resembled that of a man who had simply fallen asleep. Lieutenant James Bradley later noted that the remaining 200 bodies from Custer's command were strewn between the hills and the river, near Sitting Bull's abandoned camp. In a correspondence to a newspaper, Lieutenant Bradley conveyed to the public that the remains of the deceased had not been subjected to severe mistreatment. He reassured in his letter that there was minimal mutilation, and the injuries he observed seemed to result from the act of finishing off a wounded individual. Nothing more. Regrettably, he was not truthful. I have come across accounts stating that Lieutenant Bradley claimed the bodies were not significantly mutilated. Private Charles Wendolph, one of the soldiers who also accompanied Bentine to the battlefield, later remarked, "It was considerate of him to protect the feelings of the relatives, but the bodies were indeed severely mutilated. Some were so badly damaged that it was difficult to discuss. The majority of the corpses exhibited horrific damage. For instance, Isaiah Dorman, a Black Scout, was extensively mutilated, and the enemy had left a kettle filled with his own blood beside him as a form of insult. Most of the bodies had been scalped. Many had been pierced with arrows or had suffered blunt force trauma from axes or hammers post-mortem. The entire battlefield was a display of brutality. Custer did not escape this treatment either. Officially, the soldiers documented only his visible wounds. One bullet wound was located in his chest, just below the heart, and another in his left temple. Either of these could have proved fatal. Additionally, there was a knife wound in his thigh. The soldiers reached an agreement not to disclose the fact that an arrow had been inserted in a humiliating location in his trousers. Such a detail would only distress his widow and was kept confidential for many years. His brother Tom had suffered even more severe injuries. He had been scalped, his skull was crushed, and he had been disemboweled. Had it not been for the tattoo found on his arm, he would have been unidentifiable. Given that 2 days had passed since the battle, the bodies were already in a state of decomposition by the time they were discovered. The summer sun in Montana exacerbated the situation significantly. Colonel Gibbon acknowledged that the bodies had become quite offensive by the time he arrived at the scene. The sight and odor of the deceased left an indelible mark on those who witnessed it. Most individuals believe that all those on Custer's Hill were deceased by the time Bentine arrived. However, this is not entirely accurate. Private Jacob Adams, who asserted that he was the first to locate Custer, also made another astonishing discovery on the same hill. As Adams and his fellow soldiers navigated through the devastation, they heard a distressed sound emanating from among the dead. A solitary survivor called out to them. This was a 14-year-old bay horse named Comanche, who belonged to one of Custer's officers whose body lay nearby. Comanche had sustained 7 separate wounds from bullets and arrows, and had not had any water for days. Yet he remained by his master's side. Adams and the soldiers hurried to assist him. After all, no man serves in the cavalry without a deep respect for its horses. Despite his injuries, Comanche managed to stand and rejoin the rest of the 7th Cavalry. Other surviving horses were also retrieved from the surrounding area, but Comanche's wounds and his solitary presence on Last Stand Hill garnered him special attention. Comanche eventually recovered from his injuries and enjoyed a lengthy retirement as the mascot of the 7th Cavalry before passing away in 1891. He is one of only 4 horses to receive a funeral with full military honors. June 27th was dedicated to counting and identifying the deceased. Many bodies could not be identified, and those that were often lacked certainty in their identification. Additionally, there were 19 bodies from the battle that were never located. In the years following the battle, human remains continued to be discovered in the hills surrounding the battlefield, indicating that some men may have escaped the initial chaos at Last Stand Hill, only to be hunted down later. On the morning of June 28th, the soldiers commenced the burial of the dead. Ben's team counted 208 bodies to be interred that day, while Lieutenant Bradley noted 206. Whatever the actual figure, it was a hurried task. They were concerned that Sitting Bull or other hostile Native Americans might appear, so they could not afford the time to excavate 200 proper graves. Most of the deceased were interred together in hastily dug mass graves or in shallow graves at the locations where they fell. Some graves were marked with their names. Custer and his brother Tom were laid to rest together. A grave was excavated at the base of the hill, barely 2 feet deep, just sufficient to cover the bodies. The brothers were wrapped in canvas and placed side by side. A small sled and a circle of stones were positioned to deter scavengers. There are conflicting reports regarding who precisely dug the grave and buried Custer, with several men eager to claim the honor. By 6:30 p.m., the task was completed. General Terry was keen to depart and commenced the lengthy march back to the main Bighorn River, setting out that evening. There were still 50 injured men requiring proper medical attention, and news of the defeat needed to be relayed to the authorities. The journey back to the confluence of the Little Bighorn and Bighorn River, where the steamer Far West awaited the wounded, was a long one. Medics did their best en route. At least one man underwent a leg amputation, but several, unfortunately, succumbed to their injuries. The aftermath took a significant toll on the survivors. Major Reno resorted to alcohol. He purchased 11 gallons of whiskey in the 22 days following his return from Little Bighorn. Captain Benteen also turned to drinking as a coping mechanism. This resulted in a drunken altercation between Benteen and Captain Thomas Weir, who held Benteen responsible for abandoning Custer during the battle. Benteen would not tolerate the accusation and challenged Weir to a duel to defend his honor, which Weir declined. Weir could not bear the guilt of Little Bighorn for long and was found dead in his hotel room in New York in December 1876. The steamer Far West sped up the Missouri River, carrying news of the defeat and 38 of the wounded. It broke speed records as it completed the 710-mile journey back to the 7th Cavalry's Fort Abraham Lincoln in under 3 days. The sound of the ship's arrival roused Libby Custer before dawn on July 6th. Shortly thereafter, at 7 a.m., a group of the fort's senior officers knocked on her door. Libby hurried to the door, where the officers insisted on speaking with her privately. By this time, her sister-in-law Maggie was also awake, eager for news about her brothers and her husband, Lieutenant James Calhoun, who had served alongside them. The officers escorted the women to the parlor, where they conveyed the heartbreaking news. Libby and George had been teenage sweethearts and had been married for 12 years. Their surviving love letters illustrate the depth of their affection for one another. His death was profoundly devastating for her. One of the officers, Lieutenant Gurley, recalled it as one of the most difficult tasks he had ever undertaken. Imagine the sorrow of those bereaved women, their sobs and their tears that offered no solace. To her credit, Libby Custer did not allow her grief to interfere with her responsibilities. She insisted on accompanying the officers to inform the other 26 women in the fort who had now become widows. The remainder of Libby Custer's life was shaped by her loss at Little Bighorn. She would defend her husband's legacy and hold Reno and Benteen accountable for the disaster until her passing in 1933. The news became public the following day. Washington received the telegram that morning, just 3 days after celebrating the nation's 100th birthday. The news of Custer's defeat was shocking. It had dominated the newspapers for several days, and speculation ran rampant. Many began to search for someone to blame. Custer's recklessness, Benteen and Reno's shortcomings. The nation could only mourn the aftermath of one of the most significant defeats they would ever endure at the hands of the Native Americans.